Chapter 8. The Chimera people turned up at 9:15. 2 solid, grey-haired, double-chinned men and a thin, elegant woman who wanted to know how to keep fabulous winged monsters out of the ventilation shafts of their new leisure complex. Paul smiled, tried to look like he knew what a chimera was, and said, "Chicken wire." That seemed to satisfy the clients, who thanked him and went away again. Easy peasy. And that was it. Nothing to do till lunchtime. Nothing to do except sit behind his desk and wait for something to happen. It didn't take long for Paul to realise that he'd misjudged being chased by goblins, tortured by the Fae, threatened by bicycles and sent to the next world for the petty cash float. None of them were fun by any means, but they were all a whole lot better than being bored to death. He didn't dare leave the office or read the paper or get out a pack of cards and play patience for fear that someone would come in and find him. If he went to Christine or Julie and confessed that he had nothing to do, there was every chance he'd tell Mr. Tanner, who could be relied on to find him something truly horrible to occupy himself with. If Sophie had still been there, of course, they could have had one of their brittle, fragmented conversations, but she wasn't. He had the use of a telephone, but he couldn't think of anybody who'd want to talk to him. "This is stupid," he told himself. "This is my lifespan, something I'll never get again, being frittered away like it's not worth anything." In desperation, he dragged down the office procedures manual and opened it at random. Mountains. Movement of. It is the responsibility of the individual practitioner, not the firm, to make certain that all necessary planning consents are in place before mountains are moved in accordance with client's instructions. Your attention is specifically directed to approval of reserved matters, access, environmental issues, landscaping, etc., which may need to be resolved before work can be commenced. Indemnity should be obtained in advance from the client in respect of curses, blood feuds, and arising from the displacement of troll and goblin colonies caused by mountain relocation. Any buried treasure, abandoned dragon hordes, lost dwarf cities, petroleum, natural gas, and other mineral resources uncovered during the removal process remain the property of J.W.W., not the individual practitioner. In the event that mountain removal wakes a nameless evil from its slumber in the bowels of the earth, it is your responsibility to ensure that the firm's insurers are informed at the earliest possible opportunity. To hell with it, Paul thought. If they fire me, so much the better. If Mr. Tanner turns me into an earwig, I'll be better off. Earwigs don't have to put up with this sort of... Mr. Carpenter. He hadn't heard her come in. He dropped the book on the desk and it closed with a snap. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Paul shook his head and smiled feebly. No, really," he said. What can I do for you?" As usual, Countess Judy looked completely different from how she'd looked the day before. Today she was tall, long, and almost painfully thin. Her hair was bright silver to match her eyes, and flowed down over her shoulders like lava from an ice volcano. She wore 8 rings on her fingers, each ring silver and studded with pale jewels. "Yesterday you were asking about the possibility of taking action to rescue Mr. Shamway and your car. At that time I told you there was nothing we could do. On reflection, I believe there's a procedure that might be worth trying." That was different. Paul sat up. The palms of his hands were itching, and he could feel his heart beating. "Right," he said. That's great. What do you want me to do?" The Countess's forehead clouded a little. "I appreciate your offer, Mr. Carpenter," she said, "but in this instance I hardly feel it would be appropriate for you to be directly involved. What I have in mind involves the use of intermediaries to negotiate a settlement with the dissidents." "Oh," Paul said, and then he thought, "Better still, in fact bloody wonderful. Someone else will have to go and I won't." "Absolutely," he said. "Great idea." "However," the Countess went on, "in light of your wish to be involved, you may care to assist in the overall coordination of the project, unless," she added, glancing quickly at the closed book on Paul's desk, "there are other matters that require your attention." "Nothing that can't wait," Paul replied crisply. I saw those Chimera people earlier today, so that's all done and dusted, and Ms. Horrocks can do the banking on her own if I'm not back in time to give her a hand." "Splendid," Countess Judy said. She stood up, and Paul couldn't help but notice what a perfectly composed picture she made, framed by the doorway behind her. Instinct, presumably. "In that case, I'll trouble you to arrange an initial meeting with the intermediaries. The address and contact details are in the file." What file? Oh, Paul realised. That file. The one on the desk that wasn't there 10 seconds ago. Please report to me as soon as you've made contact. When she'd gone, Paul picked up the file and pulled out a sheaf of papers, neatly held together with a treasury tag. The first thing he came to was a blank sheet of headed notepaper, rather grubby, crumpled and carefully smoothed flat. EKD Agencies, followed by an address in Bermondsey, a factory or warehouse by the looks of it. There was also a phone number. He braced himself and dialed the number. No reply. Next in the bundle was a handwritten note, very small, cramped, pointy writing, done with an incredibly fine-nibbed pen. Mostly it was dates and numbers, but at the bottom were a few sentences. It cost Paul much squinting and the foundations of a world-class headache before he could make them out. Do not telephone. Personal visit essential. Ask for the boss, who will not be there. Extremely suspicious, secretive, nervous and annoying. Mostly lies in any case. Wednesday. Apart from that, the bundle was mostly old J.W. invoices marked paid for services, various matters, legal and financial advice, emergency supplement 25%, interim account for the attention of Derek. The only other thing was a dainty little Victorian silver locket on a chain, loose in the bottom of the file. Bermondsey, Paul thought. Personal visit essential. Well, why not? Anything to get out of the office. He was just walking through the front door into the street when a voice called to him. Oh, no. Not you, he said. Hey, you're on duty. You shouldn't leave reception. Mr. Tanner's mum grinned at him. Today she was wearing brunette, with enormous eyes and the sweetest little rosebud mouth you ever... Paul turned away, scarlet as a bus. That's what you think, lover, she replied. Velma's going to cover for me while I'm out. Aren't you, dear? Paul looked past her into the office. An identical doe-eyed, rosebud-mouthed brunette was waving at him from behind the desk. She's hoping that nice young bike messenger's going to call again. She's got this thing about men in crash helmets, you see. Mr. Tanner's mum added in a broad whisper. Compared to her, I'm practically normal. Come on, where are we going? All right, Paul hissed, but I'm not going out with you looking like that. Mr. Tanner's mum glanced down. What? You mean horizontal stripes? Everyone says I can carry them off. But if you'd rather... Not the clothes, Paul growled. You know perfectly well. Fine, Mr. Tanner's mum snapped. All right, if you want, I'll change into something really frumpy and boring and yitch. Is that what you want? Yes. She grinned at him and then turned into an exact replica of Melt's. Happy now? Paul groaned. Look, he said, what do you get out of this, picking on me like you do? Can't you go and persecute somebody else for a change? Now she was looking up at him and out of Meltz's soft blue eyes. That's what I get for rescuing you from the dungeons, is it? Charming. Not unexpected, but charming. A tear formed in the corner of her eye. If it hadn't appeared perfectly on cue, Paul could have sworn it was real. Sorry, Paul snapped. All right then, wear what you like, and I'm grateful, really. It's just you can be so... So what? My sentiments exactly, Paul thought. So long as she stopped being Melts, which was gross, it really wasn't any of his business. And he shouldn't have said that about persecuting. Nothing, he sighed. Let's just go, all right? Mr. Tanner's mum smiled brightly and turned back into Rosebud Brunette. You're a bit strange, though, she said, as he hurried down the street. He noticed that she had no trouble at all keeping up, even though his legs were much longer. He wondered whether, if he looked closely, he'd see her feet actually touching the ground at all. Looking closely, however, wouldn't be a sensible move. Any normal boy your age would be thrilled sick to be seen out with something like me. Something, Paul repeated. I think that explains it all, don't you? She just shrugged. So you're into humans, she said. I'm broad-minded, so am I. All right, she added as he rolled his eyes. I'll stop it and be good. You didn't tell me where we're going. Bermondsey, Paul replied. It says Unit 5 Skivers Walk, so I think it's a factory or warehouse, actually. Mr. Tanner's mum smiled. Great. I rather like them. They're sweet. You know where we're going, then? She nodded. Glad I decided to come now, aren't you? Don't worry. Nothing to be afraid of. Not if I'm with you. Really, Paul thought. According to the timetable, if we catch a 37A2... She hit his arm playfully. He was proud of how he managed to stifle the shriek of pain. No buses when you're with me, silly, she said. I never go on buses. No privacy. She whistled and held up her hand. At once a taxi appeared. Paul wasn't sure, but as he climbed in, he reckoned he caught a glimpse of round, red eyes in the driver's compartment. He shuffled along the seat, trying to keep away from Mr. Tanner's mum's legs, which seemed to fill all available space. Aren't you cold dressed like that? He asked sourly. Me? Nah. She twitched her nose at him. Think about it. I'm covered from head to foot with thick black fur. It's just that you can't see it under the monkey suit. Paul made a point of looking out of the window. I wanted to ask about that, he said. How'd you do it? I mean, he added quickly before she could make anything of it. Is it like effective magic? What the Countess does, I mean. She laughed. Not likely, she said. That's fey stuff. Our lot don't hold with that. Fact is, we reckon it's unethical. Unethical? Paul nearly choked. That's a bit rich, isn't it? Coming from... Don't be nasty, Mr. Tanner's mum interrupted. As it happens, we have a complex and highly developed tradition of moral philosophy. You may think that to us ethics is a southeastern English county pronounced with a lisp, but that says more about you than us, if you ask me. But that's all right, she added, her voice softening. You don't know any better, so I forgive you. Paul felt something scarily hand-like on his knee and shifted in his seat. Anyway, she went on, to answer your question, no, we don't do effective magic. When she shifts shapes, we shift shapes. It's not just, what is it Judy calls it? Trompe-l'oeil. If you were to cut me open with a knife right now, I'd be solid ape derivative down to the bone, just furrier than most, that's all. Paul hadn't realised that Bermondsey was such a long drive from the city, though it was possible that something akin to effective magic was interfering with his perception of time. He was, however, extremely grateful when the taxi eventually stopped. Skiver's Walk turned out to be old brown brick, dusty windows and flaking paint. Bad camouflage, he couldn't help thinking. If you wanted to hide paranormal activity in a modern London, you'd do better with concrete steel and smoked glass. Maybe they were into Victoriana, or just liked the way it was. Are we here? He asked. She nodded. We want number 5, she said. It's round the side, down a little sort of alley. I keep telling them it's too Harry Potter for words, but they won't listen. They've actually got a notice on the door saying no callers, would you believe it? Might as well have a sign saying suspicious building this way, folks, in flashing green neon. Still, nobody ever said that the little buggers were any too bright. Paul knocked and waited. Then Mr. Tanner's mum shoved him out of the way and knocked, and they waited. Then they both tried knocking again, and Mr. Tanner's mum produced a spike-pole tomahawk from inside her dress and chopped a large splinter out of the door. Then they waited some more. It's all right, she told him. They're always like this. Shy. She clouted the door hard with the side of her boot, making it shake. Would you mind putting that away? Paul muttered, nodding towards the axe in her hand. Before someone sees. Vasspot. The tomahawk vanished from between her fingers. Actually, you could set off a bomb on the doorstep and nobody take any notice. Glamour, you see. I guess that's how they get away with the bloody stupid decor. She clumped the door ferociously with her balled fists, threw back her head and howled like a wolf. 10 seconds later, the door opened on a chain. "Yo," said a voice. "It's yo." Mr. Tanner's mum scowled at the crack between door and frame. "Let us in, you pillock, or I'll introduce you to my friend here. You want that?" The door swung open as though blown out by an explosion. "Get in," snapped the voice, "and please don't threaten me again. You know how it upsets me." Paul stepped in quickly before the voice could change its mind. The building he found himself standing in seemed vaguely familiar, though he knew for a fact he'd never been there in his life before. And then he figured it out. It was exactly like the warehouse locations they were so fond of using in 1970s cop shows, where Bodie and Doyle shoot it out with evil masked terrorists. Everything was just so, from the patches of white mould on the bare brick walls to the rusty chains dangling from rickety catwalks overhead, and thus, of course, entirely unconvincing. "Shh," warned the door opener. "They're all fast asleep." Paul looked at him. He was a short, middle-aged, glasses thinning on top, in a brown warehouse coat with biros in the top pocket. The only thing about his appearance that Paul was prepared to believe in was the look of fear and disgust on his face. "I'm sorry," he began. "I'm from J.W.Wells. I'm here to ask you if you'd be prepared to help us out with a job where—" The man stared at him through his 1/4-inch thick lenses. "You don't want to buy anything then?" "No. Sorry." The tension in the man's face reduced considerably. "That's all right, then. Thought you would have said so earlier. You had me worried there for a minute." Paul thought about that. "You don't want people to buy anything?" he asked. The man shuddered. Over his shoulder in the vast gloom of the warehouse interior, Paul could see row upon row of wooden packing cases, piled on top of each other, a dozen high. "Too right," the man said. "Oh, then why?" "Bastards," the man cut in savagely. "They turn up on the doorstep without buy or leave, hammer on the door, won't go away, and then they want to buy stuff, and then they phone." he added bitterly, and send faxes. If it's up to me, I'd hang the lot of them. As if on cue, a distant telephone started to ring. The man swung round and yelled, "Shut up!" at the top of his voice, and wiped his hands nervously on the front of his coat. "It rings for bloody ages sometimes," he said. "Minutes at a time. You'd think they'd have something better to do, wouldn't you?" He shook himself like a dog, and then walked away briskly. "Come on, then, if you're coming," he called back after them. "And for pity's sake, don't make a noise. They won't thank you for waking them up, you know." Mr. Tanner's mum's 4-inch stilettos made a noise like Fred and Ginger working out in a rickety iron bridge, but it was Paul who got shushed when he tripped over a cardboard box on the floor. "Who are they?" he hissed at Mr. Tanner's mum, as the man opened a door in the wall and passed through. "You mean you... I thought Judy would have told you." Well, no, she didn't. Who? Shh! Don't you start." It was dark in the room that they'd been ushered into, dark enough to give Paul a nasty pain in the memory. Happily, the man turned on the light. "Should be all right," he said. "This is the office. Nobody comes in here." Paul could see why. There was probably a desk under all that paper. Hardly surprising if there turned out to be a seam of coal, too. The floor was unsimilarly elusive under a crust of old envelopes, crumpled newspaper, plastic sandwich boxes, and old brown paper bags spotted with mouse droppings. There was a chair that nobody would ever want to sit in, under any circumstances. "Right," the man said. "You sure you don't want to buy anything?" "Positive," Paul said, with feeling. The man glanced at him, frowned, and gave him the benefit of the doubt. "I had to ask," he said. "We had 4 of them in here the other week. One of them," he added with a shudder that started at his toes, "asked to see a catalogue. Just as well it was me here that day. I can take it. What's she doing here anyway?" "Just being friendly," Mr. Tanner's mum said. The man made a soft, spluttering noise and looked away. Paul took a deep breath. "The thing is," he said, 3 of our people are sort of trapped in this dungeon." The man nodded. His manner had changed when Paul said trapped and dungeon, as though the horrible, weird interlude was finally over and they'd got back to the real world. "Apparently it's something to do with the Fae." Now the man was scowling, as if Paul had offended him in some way. "Oh, yes. That's what I was told. Grendel's aunt, if that means anything to..." "Oh, yes." Now he was unoffended again. Businesslike, sympathetic. "And you want them got out of there?" "Well, yes, if that's all right. I mean..." "Of course it is." The man took a biro from his top pocket and pulled the cap off with his teeth as he reached for a piece of paper with his other hand. "Go on." That's all I know about it, really," Paul said. "I was in there with them for a bit, but I didn't really get a good look at where I was or anything." The man looked up sharply. "Yo, we're in the dungeon," he said, "and Yo got out." "I got him out," Mr. Tanner's mum put in. The man appeared to lose interest. "Well, we could see what we can do for Yo. Let's have some details." Paul nodded. "OK, probably best if I start with some names." The man winced as if Paul had burned him. "Bloody hell," he snapped at Mr. Tanner's mum. "Didn't you tell him? You should have told him before you brought him here." She pulled a remorseful face. "Sorry about that," she said. "Only when he starts chattering away, it's a job to make him shut up. No names," she said to Paul, all school-teacherish. "They don't like them. It's not the done thing. Perhaps you'd better leave this to me." Paul ignored her. "Just a second," he said. "Oh, I know names." "Allergic," the man muttered. "Tell him to stop, will you? For..." Did you threaten to kill me the other day?" "Threaten?" The man looked blank. "What do you take me for?" "Answer the question. Are you accusing me of something or what?" Paul breathed out through his nose. "Answer the question," he repeated. "With a statement," he added. "Please." The man glanced nervously at Mr. Tanner's mum and then said, "No." "Satisfied?" Hardly, Paul thought, but verbal bludgeoning wasn't his style, just as dormice very rarely pull down full-grown elephants. "Sorry," he said, "only I was talking to someone just the other day, and this business about being allergic to names cropped up, so I wondered, that's all." The man opened his mouth, but Mr. Tanner's mum beat him to it. "It's not important," she said firmly. "Just trust me, all right? It's no big deal." That was disconcerting, to say the least, because in all matters not involving personal relationships and garment removal, Paul realised that he did trust her. He had no idea why. "Fine," he said. "So what do you want to know?" The man was still quivering slightly, but he seemed relatively coherent. "You say you've got 3 people needing rescuing from the dungeons. Humans." "Well, of course they..." Paul thought about it. Well, no, he amended. One's a dwarf and another's a car. It is now, I mean. She used to be human. That didn't bother the man one bit. Right, he said, making notes in the back of an envelope. One human, one dwarf, one... He looked up and grinned suddenly. One convertible. How long have they been there, do you know? Paul glanced at his watch and figured out the time to the nearest half hour. God only knows what sort of state they're in by now, he added. I was only in there a few minutes and I was about ready to crack up. Don't worry about it, the man said, with actual sympathy. You're not the first, won't be the last, and we'll see what we can do about your friends, he added. Not promising anything, mind, but we'll see how we go. Paul nodded. He wasn't reassured and he didn't feel better, but at least something had been done, or was about to be done, or might get done at some indeterminate point in the future. Is there anything else? He asked. Suddenly he wanted to be back in his nice, safe office. I can get you a cup of tea if you like, the man said, but Mr. Tanner's mum shot him a vicious scowl. Just being polite, he grumbled, that's all. I think we'd better be getting back, Paul said, nodding to Mr. Tanner's mum. I don't suppose your friend's going to want to stay on reception all day. My great aunt, actually, and yes, she would. Some days you need to prise her out of there with a crowbar. They tiptoed back out of the way they'd come in, the man poking his head round the door and looking both ways before he let them pass into the main warehouse. We'll be in touch, he said, as he shooed them into the street. Please don't phone. Then he slammed the door hard, and they stood listening to bolts shooting home and locks grunching for about 30 seconds. Actually, they're all right once you get to know them, Mr. Tanner's mum said, as she flagged down a taxi. At least if you can learn to cope with us, they're not a whole lot worse. It was only as the taxi pulled away and Paul shuffled out of reach of an absently straying hand that he remembered something he'd seen propped against the warehouse wall. Glimpsed out of the corner of his eye, a rickety, shabby, dusty old rally bicycle. When Paul got home, there was a letter waiting for him on the mat. Sure, Paul got letters. Several public companies and government bodies wrote to him at least 4 times a year, and the bank seemed almost pathetically keen to keep in touch. Letters from people, on the other hand, weren't particularly common. What made this one stand out, however, was the American stamp and the handwriting on the envelope. Dear Paul, it said, well, the weather here is very nice and your father and I are having a good time. The neighbours are friendly and there are some nice shops. We have bought a big trailer so we can go touring in the fall. However, I'm still having trouble with my feet. I am sorry to have to tell you that your Uncle Ernie died last week. I don't suppose you remember him at all. You were quite small the last time he came to the house. The funeral will be in Ireland, so I don't suppose you'll be able to get time off work to go. His lawyers have written us that there's a box of his stuff at their office. Dad and I don't want anything particularly, so if you want to go and collect it, you can keep anything you want and welcome. The lawyers are quite handy for where you work. They're in Gray's Inn Road. You could drop by in your lunch break. I enclose their card, and Dad has written on the back that you can have the box. Hope you're well, Mum. Paul picked up the card and looked at it. On one side, the firm's name, Messrs. Swindle, Frettenham and Shark. On the other, his father's heavy, blunt letters. Paul Carpenter is my son. He can have Ernie's old junk as I don't want it. D. Carpenter. Christ, he thought. It was, he reflected, the first time he'd ever inherited anything, and since Uncle Ernie only mattered to him because of the remote chance he might be the Ernest Carpenter who'd written part of the chapter in the Office Procedures Manual, his death wasn't a desperately harrowing event. The timing of his sudden windfall was something quite other, as spiky with implications as a hedgehog group hug. But his parents couldn't be involved in J.W.W. stuff, could they? And they wouldn't lie to him, or anything like that. Nor, Paul decided, he could be fairly sure they wouldn't. In the normal course of things, since in order to lie you must first communicate. He thought for a moment. He'd had a letter from his parents before. One, enclosing a note for him to pass on to the bank, cancelling his subsistence allowance when he'd got his job. It'd been pleasant enough, but laconic to the point of terseness. There hadn't been any of the gushing personal detail that his mother had crammed into this one. Another point he couldn't help but notice was his mum's writing style had changed rather, and some of the turns of phrase didn't sound like her at all. He tried to analyse the differences, but the only one he could put his finger on was that when he was a kid, all her sentences tended to start with the word dawned. That, he admitted, could be accounted for by context. He put the card in his wallet and left the letter on the hall shelf, mostly covered by his library book, but with one corner showing. The woman who collected Paul from the waiting room introduced herself as Mrs. Leary. She was smart, brisk, and moderately friendly, which made a pleasant change after a morning helping Christine move more filing cabinets. "I have to say, I never met your uncle, was it?" she said over her shoulder, as Paul followed her across a savannah of deep, monogrammed beige carpet. Great-uncle," he replied. I think. My parents were always a bit vague. You know, everybody was uncle this or aunt that. Anyway, we weren't close or anything like that." Mrs. Leary took him to a small room with a plain desk and a wall full of prints of great 19th century judges. They gave the impression of having ended up there because there was nowhere else to banish them to, like the Picts. The box of Uncle Ernie's effects was on the desk when he got there. A long time ago it had contained tinned South African peaches. "That's it," said Mrs. Leary. "And here's a note of our charges," she added, handing him a scary-looking envelope. "No need to bother with that now. Next week will do fine." Paul looked at the box. You were his lawyers," he said. Can you tell me anything about him?" Mrs. Leary shrugged. "Not very much, I'm afraid. We were the executors, and exactly there was only just enough money to cover the funeral and our costs. The nursing home got rid of the clothes and bits and pieces. Apart from this, there's photos and stuff. They don't like to throw them away without asking." Paul hesitated. For some reason, he didn't feel like going through the box at home, or even back at the office. "Would it be all right if I just sat here for a few minutes and had a look through?" he asked. "If I'm not in the way or anything?" Mrs. Leary smiled. "You go ahead," she said. "I'll leave you to it if that's all right. I'm just next door, so when you're finished, just knock and I'll take you back to reception. This place is a bit of a maze, I'm afraid." Compared to 70 St. Mary Axe, it was a Roman road across a desert, but Paul thanked her and she went away. He sat down, composed himself, and peered into the box. Someone had gone to the trouble of typing out a list. 1 library ticket, 1 Sea Scout badge, 1 pen, 1 watch, broken, 1 screwdriver, 1 packet of coloured chalks, 3 photograph albums. Flawlessly accurate, you had to give them that. He opened the box of chalks, closed it and put it back. Shook the watch just in case, tried the pen, which had run out, flicked through 2 of the albums, which were both full of black and white photos of people he didn't recognise. Then he opened the envelope and learned that he owed Messrs. Swindle, Frettenham and Shark £100 plus VAT. That sort of a day, really. "All done," Mrs. Cherry chirped at him when he asked to be let out. "Was there anything nice?" Paul smiled thinly and handed her a cheque. She thanked him very politely and held the door for him on the way out, since his hands were full of the cardboard box. It was raining outside, and needless to say, he hadn't worn his coat. "Anything in there for me?" Mr. Tanner's mum chirped at him as he trudged past reception. He stopped and smiled at her. "Sure," he said. "In fact, you have a choice. Packet of coloured chalks or a screwdriver." Her face straightened. The trademark smirk evaporated. "Let me see," she said. "Don't be silly. I was only kidding. It's just some junk left me by some uncle I never met since I was a—" "Let me see," she repeated, in such a stern and commanding voice that for a moment Paul pitied Mr. Tanner for his childhood. "I may not be the most powerful rune in the charm, but I've got a sense of smell, and that box stinks." It took a second for the penny to drop. Oh, he said. You can smell magic and stuff." Mr. Tanner's mum sighed impatiently, and then froze for a moment, as if she'd been turned to stone. Paul was about to panic and start yelling for help when she exploded with a window pane rattling sneeze. Apparently it was her turn with the office called. "That's one way of putting it. Take all day to explain, and most of it go over your head. You'd feel like a dwarf in a strip club. Let me see that box." He shrugged and put it down on the desk. As far as I'm concerned, you can keep it. Cost me £100 I haven't got, for one." He stopped as Mr. Tanner's mum yelped with pain. The Sea Scout badge clattered on the desk. "What's the matter?" "That," she replied, sucking her fingers. "Bloody thing. Could have done me an injury." "What, you pricked your finger on the pin or something?" She gave him an icy scowl and lifted her hand for him to see. The skin on the pads of her thumb and forefinger had been melted, and blisters had already started to swell. "Shield," she explained. "What'd you say your disgusting uncle did for a living?" "No idea," Paul replied. "Well, this shield," Mr. Tanner's mum went on, "is a really nasty, very rare and expensive piece of specialised kit. In fact," she added, pushing it across the desk at him with the tip of a pencil, "I'm fairly sure it's illegal. Bloody well ought to be anyhow. She paused, sneezed again, and then went on. It's to protect humans against creatures of darkness. She scowled at him, like me. Paul could feel himself go red in the face. I'm terribly sorry, he said. I had no idea. Well, now you know. Look, will you put that bloody thing away? It's giving me a nut migraine just looking at it. He picked it up nervously, but he couldn't feel anything unusual at all. He dropped it in his pocket and pulled down the flap. That's what you could smell, was it? Mr. Tanner's mum grunted. I remember you telling me once that your family are a load of bastards, she said. Should have listened. Let's see what else you've got in there before you accidentally kill the whole office. Sure, Paul said. Look, would you rather I held them up for you to see, in case there's any more dangerous stuff? She nodded, and he took out the packet of chalks. When she saw them, Mr. Tanner's mum opened her eyes wide, then grinned. Stone me, she said. Haven't seen any of them in a long time. What? But Mr. Tanner's mum just shook her head, still upset presumably because of the shield. Put them somewhere safe and forget about them, she said. They'll come in handy one of these days, but they're not something you want to go playing with, right? Anything else? Paul held up the pen, the broken watch, and the screwdriver. This time Mr. Tanner's mum gave a low whistle. And all this shit used to belong to your uncle, did it? She said. Great-uncle, Paul replied. I think. I never really knew him, to be honest. Count your blessings, Mr. Tanner's mum replied, dabbing at her nose with a Kleenex. All right, here's a couple of clues. That watch thing, you probably noticed, it doesn't go. That's right, Paul said. At least, I assume it doesn't. I tried winding it. Mr. Tanner's mum opened her eyes wide. You didn't try setting their hands? No? Why? She smiled. That's another truly horrible gadget you've got there, she said. Reason it doesn't go is that it's not meant to. Quite the reverse. If you pull out the little winder thing and set the hands, then wind it up until it starts ticking, it freezes time. Like I said, truly horrible and antisocial. I suggest you get rid of it, but that would be really irresponsible. Imagine, you chuck it away, someone picks it up and tries to see if it'll go. Paul shuddered. What would you suggest? He said. Strong room, she replied, in a sealed box marked Do Not Touch. I'll put it away for you if you like. Thanks, Paul said, with feeling. Is that the lot? Mr. Tanner's mum shook her head. The pen and the screwdriver aren't quite so bad, but you don't want to leave them lying about either. Probably best if I put the whole lot away for you, and the chalks, she added. Maybe a touch too quickly. Right? Absolutely, Paul said. Really, I didn't have the faintest idea. How's your hand? Painful, she replied. Hang on, what's that in the bottom of the box? Books? Photo albums. Maybe you could check them out for me, just in case. She hesitated and then grunted. Oh, go on then. Give them here, one at a time. Paul put them on the desk. She used the pencil to turn the pages. Anything? Paul asked. Nah, just a lot of boring pictures of ugly people. Your family, presumably. She bent her head down and sniffed. Can't smell anything, so I'm guessing they're all right. How'd you say you came by this lot? I told you, it got left to me. Well, not me, my mum and dad, but they didn't want it. She was looking at him very oddly. He died then. This uncle of yours? Apparently. I haven't seen the body or anything. He meant it sarcastically, but the look on her face startled him. What? You think something's wrong? A debate of some kind was going on behind her eyes. No way of knowing which side won, but she lowered her voice and leaned forward a little. A suggestion for you. Whatever you do, don't let Countess Judy know about this. Why not? Her eyes sparkled. Because I say not, that's why. Right, you take on the photo albums, I'll deal with the rest of it. Go on then, she said, before he could say anything. Piss off, shoo. That was odd too. Normally Paul had trouble getting away from her. Still, he wasn't complaining. He thanked her once again and retired to his office. There was a note on his desk in Countess Judy's tall, slanting handwriting. He dumped the photo albums on the shelf and picked it up. My office, 230, JDCB. One damn thing after another, Paul muttered under his breath, and checked his watch. He had 10 minutes to kill, no work to do, and he wasn't sure offhand what day of the week it was. He took the Sea Scout badge out of his pocket, meaning to hide it away in his desk along with the run-out biros and polo mint wrappers. It lay in his hand, harmless as a paperclip. Uncle Ernie, he thought. My inheritance. Just a stupid badge, but he couldn't bear either to hold on to it or put it away. On an impulse that came from a part of his brain that he didn't bother with much, he opened his jacket and pinned it to the lining. Then it was time for his meeting. Countess Judy looked older and thinner than she'd been that morning, as though she'd had too much on her mind to bother putting her face on. When he walked in, she avoided his gaze, which was very unusual. In a way, she looked more real than he'd ever seen her before. "You'll be delighted to hear," she said, "that the negotiations have been successful." Probably because his brain was still awash with coloured chalks and being parted from £100, it took Paul a moment to remember what she was talking about. "That's fantastic," he said. She shrugged. "There are aspects of the matter that you aren't familiar with," she said vaguely. "Rest assured that the negotiations were long and involved, and also cost this firm a great deal of money. However, the main thing is that Mr. Wormtoter, Mr. Shumway, and your car have been retrieved. Your part in this," she looked up at him and then abruptly looked away. "I owe you a debt of gratitude, Mr. Carpenter," she said stiffly. "Thank you." Paul hadn't been expecting that. It's all right," he mumbled. "Also," the Countess was holding out a small rectangular piece of paper. "Reimbursement," she said, "for out-of-pocket expenses." He took the paper, a cheque for £100. "Thank you," he said, and then, "Why?" She was practically fidgeting. "Come now, Mr. Carpenter. You know what they say about gift horses. Do you want the money or not?" He looked at it again. £100, and drawn in a proper bank, not the bank of the dead. But you don't have to," he said slowly. "I mean, what's it for?" "I told you," she snapped. "It's what you had to pay to get that box from the lawyers. Or have you suddenly come into money, and £100 is neither here nor there? The signature was just a squiggle. Pity. He'd have been interested in knowing which of the partners had signed the cheque." "But it's my stuff," he said quietly. "The firm doesn't have to pay for me to get my own things. I mean, it's really kind of you and all that, but I can't take it." "For God's sake!" The look on Countess Judy's face was terrifying. "Just take the goddamn cheque and get out of my office." Paul shook his head and put the cheque down on the desk. "No," he said. "I'm very sorry, but I can't. Really." For a moment he thought that the Countess was going to hit him. She stood up, but then it was as though an invisible hand had shoved her down into her chair. "Very well," she said icily. "That's up to you. Far be it from me to lecture you about gratitude. I take it that now you're independently wealthy, you won't be needing the salary review that was scheduled at the end of the month. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." She looked down at the papers on her desk. Paul could feel her willing him to leave. Also, he could feel her failing. He couldn't think of anything to say that wouldn't make things worse. He turned, at last, to leave. "Oh, Mr. Carpenter." He stopped, but didn't look round. "If you don't have anything else to do, there's always the Mortensen printouts. It's been quite a while since you did anything about them, so there's probably quite a backlog. Julie will bring them down to you if you ask her." Quite why that made Paul feel so angry, he wasn't quite sure, but it did. He turned around slowly and faced her. "Right," he said. "Will do, but it's not fair. You're not giving me a pay rise." He realised how ridiculous that sounded. After all, he was pathetically useless at his job, so fairness really didn't come into it. He waited for her to make the point, but she didn't. "I mean," he went on, "just because I wouldn't take a cheque, that's all." A look had crept into Countess Judy's eye that he couldn't place. At any rate, she didn't seem quite so apprehensive about looking at him. "Perhaps your principles do you credit, Mr. Carpenter," she said. "However, I'd find this display of conspicuous integrity a little more convincing if I didn't happen to know you have indeed come into money lately. Obviously, it makes a difference." "You what?" Paul thought. "I'm sorry, I don't quite—" "Come now," she went on. Crafty, that was it. She was looking crafty. "You've been supplementing your income, let's say, which is why you don't need the money. That's what's behind that little exhibition we had just now. You must have a fairly low opinion of our intelligence, Mr. Carpenter." "I really haven't got the faintest—" "Indeed. You were sent to deal with a wyvern on behalf of a client. You dispatched the creature, so I gather, but I don't seem to have any record of you surrendering the eye stone. Did it simply slip your mind, Mr. Carpenter? Or weren't you aware how valuable they are? But of course you must be, or why else would you go to the trouble of prizing it loose, a squeamish individual like yourself? Clearly that's where your newfound wealth derives from, and I have to say it's not the sort of behaviour we expect from our employees. I'm disappointed. However, in light of your contribution to the release of Mr. Wormtoter, we're prepared to overlook it on this occasion. You'd do well, though, not to express your contempt for us in future by brandishing your own money under our noses. Tactless Mr. Carpenter, you should know better than that. It was probably just as well that Paul's voice appeared to have been turned off at the means. Instead of replying, he fished out the matchbox containing the stone. It would have been more impressive a gesture if he hadn't had to turn out both of his jacket pockets before he could find it, and tossed it on the desk in front of Judy di Castelbianco. Her hand shot out and covered it, and then lay quite still. "That's better," she said quietly. "Now, the Mortensen printouts." "What?" "The Mortensen printouts," she repeated. "Go and deal with them, please." Paul didn't say what he wanted to say. Instead, he nodded and left the room. He didn't start shaking until he was halfway back to his office, which was in the wrong direction for Julie's room anyhow. Cow, he thought. Horrible, evil, entirely justified cow. Not that I wanted the stupid thing anyway, but getting caught out like that. Ugh. He pulled himself together. He wasn't the first person ever, he reflected, to discover the harsh truth that our enemies are never more loathsome than when they're in the right. That was it. A vague suspicion that he'd been carting around with him for so long had finally slotted into its allotted place, and he knew. Countess Judy was, somehow or other, the enemy. Suddenly he remembered the Sea Scout badge, pinned inside his jacket. So that was why she'd been, well, practically afraid of him. Creatures of darkness and all that. He wondered if he'd burn her hand the way it had burned Mr. Tanner's mom, only she, for all her faults, wasn't the enemy. Julie had the Mortensen printouts all ready for him, bundles and bundles of them, all tied up with stationer's red tape. "That ought to keep you out of mischief for a while," she said, as he hefted the load and staggered to the door. "I'll be down with some more when you've done with those." An afternoon sorting printouts into date order turned out to be exactly what Paul needed. Mindless, repetitive work to occupy his hands and the superficial areas of his brain, while the rest of his mind slowly chewed over recent events. When going home time finally drifted by and he set off for his flat, he discovered that he'd reached a decision, and without even trying to. He'd believed Countess Judy when she had told him that the prisoners were coming home. Fine. Unaccountably, but probably because he was an idiot, he'd taken it upon himself to assume a certain level of responsibility for them. But that was all over and done with now, so whatever the big thing was that was going on all around him, civil war among the Fae, vague threats from bicycles with Moses complexes, bizarre and powerful artifacts just happening to drop into his lap at precisely the right moment. Paul believed in coincidences, but he also managed to believe in Father Christmas until he was nearly 11, so it was a good bet that anything he believed in was therefore by definition untrue. Whatever it was, and whoever was involved, it was none of his business, and quite definitely not his fault. Not his mess to tidy, not his dishes to wash, not his sink to unblock, not his socks to pair. Screw the lot of them, because he wasn't allowed to quit. He'd just sit there nice and quiet and sort Mortensen printouts until either he or the partners retired or died. As a plan of campaign, he told himself as he set his alarm and switched off the light, it was utterly flawless. It would work. It had to. Paul had been asleep for several hours. He knew that because his left arm had pins and needles where he'd been lying on it, when something disturbed him and he sat up. At first he'd guessed that he'd fallen asleep with the bedside lamp still on, but that wasn't right. He had a razor-sharp mental image of himself pressing the switch, in which case, where was all this bright stuff coming from? The answer was sitting at the foot of his bed. It was, by any objective standard, a very nice answer. Beyond question, the nicest human shape that had ever shared his bedroom with him, regardless of context. Where her short flaxen hair ended and the pale glow began was hard to say, but the way it reflected off her golden skin was really quite... "Rosie," he muttered, "bloody hell, can't you find some other poor bastard to—" She moved her head a little, and her eyes were like an unexpected brick wall across a railway track. "You're not Rosie," Paul said, his throat suddenly dry. "Mr. Tanner's mother, you're someone else." Her perfect chin moved up and down, maybe as much as an inch. "You aren't a goblin at all, are you?" She shook her head, but the glow didn't move with her. Now it seemed to be coming from just behind her back, giving the ridiculous impression that she had a pair of graceful snow-white wings. But that was daft, because if she had wings, it means she was an angel. Look, he said. I mean, who are you? She shook her head again. Fine, Paul thought. This no-name's business is really starting to annoy me. On the other hand, she hadn't winced or started when he'd said Rosie or Mr. Tanner's mum. I can tell you what I am, if you'd like, she said. Her voice was like many things, chocolate and milk and rain falling on the roof, autumn sunshine and the soft hiss of waves on a shingle beach, home and safety and melts when she was 9, and a great many other things that he'd imagined but never got round to experiencing. That'll be nice, Paul croaked. Her lips curved around a smile. I'm the girl of your dreams, she said. Don't you recognise me?